Sartre. I like Sartre because, how many of you heard of Sartre? He's a really honest atheist, right? He's whiny, he complains a lot, but he's a really, really honest atheist. He says, life has no meaning a priori. That means life has no meaning in itself. It's up to you to give it meaning and value is nothing the meaning that you choose. He says this because he's an atheist. He recognizes that there's no point to life if there is no God, because there's no one to have imbued it with a point. He says, the best you can do is try to create your own meaning. But what's the problem with that? Anyone have an idea what the problem with that is? Subjective, yes. And what does that mean? What does it mean if it's subjective?
It's relative.
Right. I like McDonald's. No, you don't. But I really do like McDonald's. But it doesn't matter. You don't argue about subjective things because subjective things aren't the truths that exist outside of the mind, right? They're just personal preferences. So in reality, if life has no meaning, but I make up my own meaning for it, is that meaning really meaningful?
That meaning isn't even real, is it?
It's not even real. I can pretend. It's me playing Let's Pretend. I'm pretending there's a meaning to life, but in itself there's really not. Well, that kind of bites. And so Sartre said, and you don't have to read this out loud, but I want to hear you to hear what the honest atheistic response to life is from Sartre. He says, when we speak of forlornness, we mean only that God does not exist, and we have to face all the consequences of this. The existentialist, which is the kind of philosopher that Sartre was, says, is strongly opposed to a certain kind of secular ethics which would like to abolish God with the least possible expense. About 1880, some French teachers tried to set up a secular ethics which went something like this. God is a useless and costly hypothesis. We are discarding it. But meanwhile, in order for there to be an ethics, a society, a civilization, it is essential that certain values be taken seriously and they be considered as having an a priori existence. It must be obligatory, a priori, to be honest, not to lie, not to beat your wife, to have children, etc. So we're going to try a little device which will make it possible to show that values exist all the same, inscribed into heaven ideas, though otherwise God does not exist. In other words, and this, I believe, is the tendency of everything we call reformism in France, nothing will be changed if God does not exist. We shall find ourselves with the same norms of honesty, progressives, and humanism, and we shall make God an outdated hypothesis which will peacefully die off by itself. Sartre says you can't do that. You can't make a secular ethics. You can't create a secular meaning of life. If all we are is sacks of flesh, there's really no point to our existence beyond just being sacks of flesh. As much as we try to get out of that, and you will run into this with your professors in your courses and with other students in your courses. They'll say, oh, I can be good without God. Oh, I can have a meaningful life without God. But you can't. If all you are is a bunch of atoms bouncing into each other, what is the meaning of atoms bouncing into each other? Nothing. And do atoms that are bouncing into each other have obligations? How on earth can you give obligations to electrons? Can't be done. So what I want to talk about now is Pascal's wager. Not because I believe it proves the existence of God, because I don't, but because I think it's a good motivator to start talking about why we should start searching and asking the questions. Pascal was a French Catholic. He lived around the time of another French Catholic named Descartes. Who knows of Descartes? French philosopher, right? Terrible philosopher, good Catholic. But terrible philosopher. And him and Pascal were like mutually opposed. And actually, I'm not so sure I think Pascal was the greatest philosopher in the world, but he had a good point, some good points. And one of those is this. Look, you have to address the question of whether or not God exists in your life. You have to address that question. And here's why. He made this little table. He said, either God exists or he doesn't exist. All right? And either you choose to believe in him or you don't. What are the consequences of that? If God exists and I believe in God, eternal happiness, right? If God does not exist and I believe in God, nothing bad happens. And if I take my faith very seriously, I'll probably live a pretty decent moral life. If God exists and I don't believe, eternal misery. And even if there wasn't a hell, at least you would lose out on the eternal happiness, right? And if God does not exist and I don't believe, nothing happens. So where's my best bet? If I'm a gambling person, because Pascal wanted to be a gambling person. Well, if I do not believe, I risk losing the best thing in the whole world, which is God forever, right? If I do believe, and God doesn't exist, I don't really lose anything. But if he does exist, eternal happiness. So he says, your best bet is to bet on that God does exist, because you don't want to risk losing the best thing in the world for all eternity, right? Your professors are going to object to this. They're going to say, well, how do you know it's the Christian God? Or how do you know it's, this, and this is a selfish argument. This is based on pure selfishness and not love of God, which are true. But they're at least motivators to get the question going. Is there an ultimate meaning of life? If I live as if there is, if I at least ask the question and start pursuing it, then I might get to live according to that ultimate meaning. If there isn't a meaning of life, and I still live like there is one, I don't really lose anything, right? But if there is a meaning of life, and I don't pursue it, then I lose out big time. So it's at least worth asking the question, okay? You have any questions so far? Okay. So before we start proving the existence of God, oh my gosh, the computer's doing things I didn't expect it to do.
Okay, Patrick, tell us a bit more about this atheism thing. Yeah, Patrick, tell us.
Certainly, yes. Well, you see, in ancient times, people like you invented stories about various gods creating the earth and mankind because you lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to understand the origins of the universe. But in my day, thanks to scientific progress, we do understand these things, and so it's no longer necessary for us to fool ourselves into thinking that some silly god created us.
But what about all that stuff that defies scientific explanation? Isn't that evidence of God's existence? Yeah, riddle us that, Patrick.
Stuff like what?
Well, how about the multitude of miracles in the Bible, chief among them the resurrection of our Lord Jesus?
Oh, you sweet little simpletons, people don't rise from the dead.
Except for that one time Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah, that was awesome.
No, what I'm saying is that Jesus never rose from the dead.
And how do you know that, Patrick?
Because it's not possible for people to rise from the dead.
Yeah, we know. That's why it was sort of a big deal when Jesus rose from the dead.
Look, I think you're far too uneducated to understand this, but if people could rise from the dead, then people would rise from the dead. If Jesus could rise from the dead, surely someone else would have risen from the dead as well.
Other people have risen from the dead.
Like who?
Like all the people in the Bible who rose from the dead because Jesus rose them from the dead not long before he himself rose from the dead.
Well, obviously you can't count those examples.
Why not, Patrick?
Because they come from the Bible, and the Bible is a ridiculous book full of silly stories that couldn't possibly happen, like...
People rising from the dead?
Exactly.
Right. So according to you, the resurrection doesn't prove the existence of God because it never happened. And we know it never happened because we know that people can't rise from the dead. And we know that people can't rise from the dead because no one ever has risen from the dead, if you don't count all the people who have risen from the dead. I think I'm onto your little trick here, Patrick. Yeah, you're a sneaky little secularist, Patrick. So your strategy for proving the non-existence of God is to systematically rule out every piece of evidence for the existence of God, solely because that evidence could be used to prove the existence of God. What's a perfectly reasonable use of the scientific method, Patrick? Yeah, we'd love to see you employ this strategy in the laboratory, Patrick. Hey, Connall, I just proved that there's no such thing as barium. And how'd you do that, Donnall? By throwing out all the samples of barium. I'm surprised more defense attorneys don't attempt this in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have conclusively proven to you that my client is innocent, as long as you ignore the murder weapon, his confession, and the 400 witnesses who saw him stab that guy in the face.
Clearly you're not enlightened enough to understand.
I mean, really, Patrick. By your logic, the first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod could prove himself to be the best-looking man in the world. All he'd have to do is lock every other male on the planet in his dressing room right before the beauty pageant begins.
Oh, no, even then I would still lose.
So I may not be a scientist, Patrick. I may not possess your superior intellect and education. I may even be a superstitious Neanderthal who thinks that thunder is what happens when God yells at leprechauns. I think it's the result of a shockwave in the air due to the sudden thermal expansion of plasma in the lightning channel, but that's because I'm stupid. Nonetheless, I still know a lame argument when I hear one. And when you accuse Christians of remaining in ignorance because they refuse to allow any evidence to challenge their theistic worldview, only to dismiss every eyewitness account of our Lord's resurrection solely because it challenges your atheistic worldview, well, that's not just lame. It's also a wee bit of the clover calling the grass green. That's an adorable Celtic twist on a classic idiom, Patrick.
Don't be absurd. I treat the Bible exactly the way I treat everything else. I'm a man of reason and evidence and facts. I'm a man of science, a world-renowned evolutionary biologist. I defy you to give me one example of something that I believe in despite no scientist ever having seen it happen. Evolution. Dang it. But really, have you actually read your holy book? Your God is a heartless, hateful, murderous ogre. There's no reason to believe in such a vile deity.
I'm sorry, Patrick. I'm going to need a second to recover from that. Yeah, Patrick, stop in the name of logic before you break my brain. Placing your failure to properly understand the justice of the Almighty aside for a moment, did you honestly just argue that God doesn't exist because he's mean? Why, if being a jerk made you cease to exist, then every war in human history would have been over the second it started. Rosie O'Donnell would have disappeared in a puff of smoke in 1998 instead of being fired from The View once every 7 minutes. And the jerk who makes those LutheranSatire videos wouldn't even be able to finish record...
LutheranSatire, watch it. They're really funny. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about, this is what I agonized over about what to go over with y'all. And, there's very limited time, so there's only so much that we can cover in this time period. So I thought the best thing we can do is that we can go over how a philosopher maybe might go about proving the existence of God. And then I have a little bit of stuff on the divinity of Christ, but really I think the exciting part will be is if you guys have questions towards the end about how to answer questions your professors have raised in class and things like that. Now the point of the video that we just showed is that science, while awesome, can't do everything. It can't answer every question that there is. In fact, science can't prove that science works because sciences depend on a lot of assumptions. Like, for example, causes happen in the world. Change is real. The world is something that we can know and understand and all these things, which are actually philosophical assumptions that science depends on. So really, science depends on philosophy and not the other way around. So we don't have to prove the existence of God through science, but we do have to prove the existence of God through philosophy. One thing I disagree with in the video, I think evolution is a pretty well-established scientific fact. I think the last 3 popes have pretty much established that that's the way it happened. And we can get to questions on that later, but let's talk about proving the existence of God. So, here are the premises and conclusions in proving the existence of God. Nothing can be the cause of itself. Pretty self-evident. There is an order of efficient causes in the world. This is what St. Thomas says. That means that one thing causes another, which causes another, which causes another. There cannot be an infinite regress in causes. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. And so he concludes there must be a first cause, which we call God. Now, how many of you guys know who well, you do know Richard Dawkins, you just saw him in the video, right? Okay, he's very, very critical in this argument, and he read this argument somewhere. I think he read it like in this format somewhere, and he thinks he understands it. And it's very embarrassing to watch somebody who's a brilliant geneticist be such a terrible philosopher. But he read this argument somewhere, and he tears it apart limb from limb in his book, The God Delusion, I think is what it's called. I read it. It's really sad to watch him. It's like watching a 5-year-old try to play basketball. It's just, except he's older, so it's not cute. So, all right. So nothing can be the cause of itself. This is where we're going to dive into some very deep philosophical waters. So be prepared to prop your eyelids open with toothpicks or something. This is not exciting. I'm going to tell you ahead of time. This is completely not exciting at all. All right. So there was this ancient Greek philosopher who was crazy, and his name was Parmenides. And he saw change in the world and said, that's an illusion, it's fake. There's no change in the world, nothing's changing, it's just an illusion that things are changing. And he said the reason why change is fake is he says you either got being or non-being, right? And change would have to mean that being, something, somehow comes from non-being, nothing. Something comes from nothing. For example, if I leave a red ball out in the sun, it's not pink, right? It's a red ball. but if later on it becomes pink as it fades, right? Well, he's saying you had not pink, and suddenly you have pink coming out of nothing. Well, that's impossible. Something doesn't come from nothing. So, change can't happen. It's all an illusion. Well, Aristotle, who was a good philosopher and who was a smart person, said that's completely messed up. That's completely wrong. First of all, if change is an illusion, your mind has to be changing as the illusion is going through. So change is really happening. But he said there's not just being and non-being. There's something in between non-being called potential, potency, potentiality. Okay? And what that means is it's, well, I have the potential to lose 5 pounds, yes? Very good. Probably not all the pizza I eat. But I don't have the potential to suddenly transform into Donnall the flying elephant, right? So there's something in me that says I could become 5 pounds lighter, but I couldn't become Donnall the flying elephant, right? So I have a potential for becoming 5 pounds lighter, but I don't have a potential for becoming Donnall. Y'all with me there? So that's a real thing inside of every changeable thing. So it's not that being is coming from non-being, it's that some kind of being is coming from being in potential. You got potential being made actual. And these are the words that St. Thomas Aquinas uses. You've got potential and actuality. Potentiality, the way things can be. Actuality, the way a thing actually is. So I actually am 170 pounds. I could potentially be 165 pounds. You all with me there? All right. So he said, so change can happen, and this is how it happens. Now, in material things, this is how you see potential. The potential is the matter, the stuff it's made of, right? The actuality is what we call the form that the matter takes on, what it becomes. So, for example, you have matter that has the form of an acorn, right? Y'all with me there? And when it grows up, that matter goes from having the form of an acorn to having the form of a tree. The potential is the matter, because that's what can change. The form, that's the actual, what it actually is. Y'all with me there? Cool. That was terrible, wasn't it? Wasn't that awful? Like your brains are melting out of your head. That was the worst thing you ever had to endure. Okay.
Isn't it technically the CO2 that changes to take the form of a tree?
The CO2 that changes.
The CO2 in the water as it gets fished, and it forms lignin, which forms the majority of the composition of the tree.
Well, those might be the details of the matter, but the general principle.
The matter of the acorn itself does not transform into the matter of a 300-foot tall oak tree.
Okay, so you're talking about. This is where it gets really funky. You're talking about the change in quantity of matter, which is not. Aristotle didn't consider that a substantial change. He considered that a quantitative change. So it's drawing other things into the same living substance and making it more of itself or a bit bigger or something like that. But it's as long as it's that same life principle, it's the same substance that's existing throughout the change. All right, so now, did I miss something? Okay, so the point here, though, is this. At any moment, matter could have any given form, right? The fact that the matter can change at all means that it doesn't have to have the form that it has. Okay? That matter doesn't have to be an acorn, but for some reason it is an acorn right now, right? That matter could be a tree. That matter could be broken apart into parts, and the chemical composition could be broken up, and you could break, I don't know what acorn atoms break up into, but they could break up into completely different substances and have completely different forms and be different things, right? But they exist in the way they exist at this moment. We call that in philosophy contingent. They don't have to be that way, but they are that way right now. And since they don't have to be that way, they need an explanation or a cause that makes them be in the way they are right now, that makes the matter in the acorn exist as an acorn, and that matter doesn't exist as in the form of a monkey or something. I don't know. Science. Somebody who's sciencey, tell me what an acorn can break down into. Carbon. Okay,
Hydrogen,
cool.
oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen.
Those things, all right? So it's existing as an acorn rather than those things. So it has to have a cause, an explanation of why it exists as an acorn and not that stuff right now, at this moment. So before we move on, we have to talk about 2 kinds of causes. Can you stick with me through 2 kinds of causes? Can you handle 2 kinds of causes? Okay. This is awful too, I promise. All right. 2 kinds of causes. We've got what we call an accidentally related causal series. This is like when you hit Dominoes. One hits that one, and then that one falls, and then it hits the next one, and then that one falls, and that hits the next one, and that one falls, right? Another example of an accidentally related causal series is parents producing offspring. Dad's live, and then he creates a child, and then that child creates another child, and that creates a child, down the line. Hopefully they wait till they're much older. The point of an accidentally ordered causal series is the cause precedes the effect in time. Dad comes before son, right? One domino hits, then the next domino falls over. And the other part is that once the effect gets going, it doesn't really need the original cause to keep going, right? If a person's father dies, does that person suddenly cease to exist? No, they keep existing, right? So that's an accidentally ordered cause series. One comes after the other, and the effect doesn't stay dependent on the cause. You all with me there? Cool. All right. Essentially ordered causal series. This is the kind that we're using in Thomas Aquinas' argument, okay? This is when the cause and the effect happen at the same time, and the effect always remains dependent on the cause. The effect can't do what it's doing without the cause, okay? So an example is books. If you look here, there's a glass with some liquid in it on top of a glass table, on top of a book, on top of a book, on top of another book. Y'all see that? If these books were all knocked out, what happened to that glass? It'd fall over, right? This is a very crude example of what St. Thomas Aquinas means by an essential order causal series. But the cause and the effect the effect is the glass being up there, right? The cause and the effect happen at the same time, and the effect is always dependent on the cause. Y'all with me there? Another example is gears in a machine, right? One gear is moving, another gear is moving, another gear is moving, another gear. This final gear that's moving is always dependent on all the other gears, right? And it happens at the same time. That's an essentially ordered cause. These are the kind of causes that Thomas uses in argument to prove the existence of God. Okay. Now, St. Thomas says that there doesn't have to be a first cause in an accidentally ordered series. You could conceivably go into the past forever. Of course, as a Christian, he believed that the universe was created and didn't have a beginning, right? But he says you can't prove that with philosophy. You have to know that only through faith we know that. But an essentially ordered cause, where the glass is on top and all the other stuff knocked over, the glass would fall, that does have to have a first cause, he says. Going back to the cogs in the machine. One cog is moved by another cog, is moved by another cog, is moved by another cog, right? I really don't know how machines work because I'm not an engineer, but I think you get back to a piston. Is anyone an engineer? Do you get to a piston? Okay, let's say a piston. Yeah. Something that has the power of motion in itself and is granting that power of motion to all of the effects in the cause. Y'all with me there? And if that piston that has, I'm totally making this up because I don't know machines, has the power of motion itself, wasn't there, none of the cogs would move at all. And they wouldn't keep moving. Y'all with me there? Same thing with the glass. You notice they're all stacked on top of each other and they hit the ground, right? The floor. There was no floor there that had the power to be where it is on its own, because every member of that series, the glass, the table part, this book, that book, is dependent on the one before, right? They all borrow their power to do what they're doing from the one before, but ultimately, there has to be a floor, right? And that floor has the power on its own to cause everything else to stay up. Y'all with me there? If it didn't have the power on its own, then everything would fall through space. Okay, very crude examples, but you get the idea, right? See? Okay, cool. So St. Thomas is saying that existence of material things is like this, right? The acorn could break up and be carbon and all kinds of other atoms and such, right? It could be those things instead of being an acorn, but it's not. At this moment, it's an acorn. And it's dependent on all kinds of causes to keep it the way it is. Again, not a sciencey person, so I'm going to throw out words that are generically related to what I think they are. So if I'm wrong, you can stop me. But like, if the air pressure wasn't what it was, the acorns wouldn't hold together.
Yeah, it would hold together.
There's stuff,
It would
though.
hold together.
There's external causes out there in the world. The physical system, if I broke it down to physics, if this is a system of physics wasn't the way that it is,
If it was a lot hotter,
yeah,
it'll
sure.
combust.
There you go. There's external causes that are contributing to the acorn's existence at every instant that the acorn is what it is, right? And if those causes weren't there, it wouldn't be an acorn anymore. It would break down into atoms, and heck, I don't know, if you get into like crazy astrophysics, maybe you get like, it would become a whole nother kind of atom. I don't know, I'm making a lot of this up as I go. But you get the point, right? You get the point. That there's a lot of things at this moment that are contributing to the acorn's existence. And if they weren't there, the acorn wouldn't exist as an acorn anymore. You all with me there? So, now those things it depends on also depend on other things, right? Just like the book stacked on top of the book on stacked on top of the book, right? And those things depend on other things. Well, St. Thomas says this chain of dependent things here and now that are causing this acorn to exist, this can't go on forever. Why? Let's think about this. A very crude example again. Let's say that I had an infinitely tall stack of books, but no ground for it to rest on. Would it stay anywhere there? Doesn't matter how long the stack of books is, does it? What if I had an infinite number of cogs, but no piston or power source to keep it moving? Would the cogs move? No. So it doesn't matter how many members I add to that series. Eventually you have to have something that has causal power in itself, right? So St. Thomas says, okay, you got the acorn, the matter, and it has this form, right? What if it's caused to be by something else that's made up of matter and form? Well, then that thing needs to be caused to be, right? Well, what if you have something else that's made up of matter and form? Well, then that thing needs to be caused to be. And it doesn't matter how many members we add to this causal chain, none of these is going to account for the existence of the acorn fully. You eventually have to get to a first cause that has its existence in itself and doesn't, in a sense, borrow it from a previous cause. Otherwise, just like the books, it would fall through. Just like the cogs, they wouldn't work. You all with me there? Okay. And what does he mean by this? So, well, I don't want to go down that path. Let's not go down that path. It's too much. All right. So, I'm skipping over a bunch, and I'm super simplifying because this can get very boring and very technical, and you will hate me forever if I keep going down this path too much longer, okay? We eventually have to get something that has existence in itself, okay? So what would this thing be? Well, St. Thomas says the first thing would have to be existence itself, right? Because if it was something that merely had existence, that means it could conceivably not have existence, right? And then it would need a cause of why it has existence, an explanation. Y'all with me? So it has to be existence itself. Now, it has to be unlimited. Why? Well, if it is existence itself, and it's limited, well, you're limiting it by introducing non-existence, right? Then it's not existence itself anymore. It can't be made of parts. It has to be purely simple. Because if it's made as parts, it would have to have a cause that brings the parts together and holds them together all the time. Well, we saw that this thing has to not have a cause of existence. It has to be the first cause, right? So it can't be made of parts. There can only be one such cause. Because if there were two, they'd have to be distinguished by having different properties, right? But if this guy lacked the properties that this guy has, that means there's some non-existence over here, right? But we said this guy has to be existence. The first cause must be limitlessly perfect, meaning it has to have all the perfections of being possible, because if it doesn't have them all, in some way it's limited by not having them, and then we've introduced non-existence back into it. And a cause has to have in some way the things that it produces in the effect, right? So we have intellect and will, right? So the cause of the existence of all things must have something analogously similar to at least intellect and will. I mean, obviously we're talking about God, so limitlessly perfect knowledge and will would be nothing like ours, right? But it would be something like it, at least in a greater degree. And so that's how Thomas Aquinas proves the existence of God. Are you all still with me? All right, so quick on objections, and then we can move on to questions, all right? So, if everything has a cause, what caused God? That's the first thing that they ask. If someone says this to you, they're not very smart people, and you should probably just walk away because it's not going to be a good conversation. St. Thomas didn't say everything has a cause. He said everything that's material needs a cause because it's made of form and matter, right? He says everything that has potential in it needs to have a cause, because remember, potential is the way something could be. So why is it the way that it is right now? We have to have an explanation, a cause. But God, being existence itself, just is because he is existence. So he doesn't need a cause. This isn't special pleading. This is, if you're just existence, there's no need for a cause for you to exist. Some people say, why assume the universe had a beginning at all? What kind of cause was that where you go backwards in time? Do you guys remember? Was it?
Accidentally.
Accidentally ordered causal series. And Thomas doesn't use these in his proof, does he? He doesn't say the universe had a beginning. He says, right now, there has to be a cause for the existence of things. Right? So it's not based on that. Even if there was a first cause, there'd be no reason to assume that it was God. But we already showed all the characteristics that follow from the first cause being existence itself, right? And that's a pretty good outline of who we mean by God as traditional theists. Another argument is this is nothing but a God of the gaps theory. Someday science will explain this. Someday, I promise you, science will explain this, they say. Well, that doesn't work. Because this is not a God of the gaps argument. This is what we call a philosophical proof, a necessary proof based on metaphysics. Well, metaphysics is not that thing that Naked Dan does out there with the crystals. You guys see Naked Dan, the protester?
Dan Schrader.
Where's
jean shorts?
Oh,
leathering.
yeah. Metaphysics is not the hippie New Age religion that Naked Dan does, though they try to use that word. Metaphysics just means the philosophy of being, right? Comes prior to science. Science actually depends on it, right? Remember, science has to know that the world is even knowable, that we can know it. Things like the law of non-contradiction and stuff like that, where you get those from metaphysics. So this comes from a science that's more, or from a philosophy that's more fundamental than science. So science will never answer these questions because it can't. It needs these answers. In fact, God has to exist for the changing things in the world that we see to exist in order for science to even be able to study them, right? So it's not going to happen. You guys heard the argument from design? Design argument? The world looks really complicated, so somebody must have designed it. You guys heard that argument? It's not a very great argument, actually, from a Thomist perspective. There's much better. Thomas provided 5. I gave you 1 tonight, right? And he gave 5, and they were much better than that. That's a God of the gaps argument. That's a, oh, science hasn't explained it, but it might someday explain it. Okay? We don't use that argument. I won't believe it unless you can prove it scientifically. How many of you have heard this one? Yes. Okay. Bad argument. It's a really bad argument. This is an example of a doctrine called scientism. Scientism is the belief that the only real knowledge is that which is obtained by the scientific method. Okay? Problems with scientism. First off, it's self-contradictory. There's no scientific experiment that can prove that the only thing we can know is that which is proved by scientific experiments. Do you follow me? Give me a thumbs up if you follow me on that. I know that was a little confusing, yes. Science can't prove that it's the only way to know stuff, right? So it's self-contradictory. Science does something kind of weird because of its method. It turns everything into like these ideal mathematical objects, in a sense, especially in physics. We talk about a perfect plane. Have any of you ever seen a perfect plane? No. Tell me about lines. Do lines exist in the real world? No. Infinitely thin thing that goes on forever? I've never seen that. Do mathematical formulas exist in the world? Have you ever run into like, oh, there's a mathematical formula walking down the street. There he goes. No, because you would run screaming in terror because math is the worst thing in the whole world, right? What science does is it abstracts, okay? So here's an example of abstraction. A black and white drawing. Is the world really black and white? No. When you make a black and white drawing, you purposely abstract away from the colors, see? What science does is it purposely abstracts away from everything that's not measurable and predictable. Okay? So our experience of color, right? Our ability to will things. Our experience of hot and cold, qualitative things, right? And it focuses only on those things that can basically be changed into a mathematical formula. Well, there's a problem. That's good if you want to do measurement and prediction, right? And science has done an excellent job at measurement and prediction. But there's a problem with that. Let's say I throw a net in the ocean, and all the holes in the net are 3 inches by 3 inches, right? And I pull the net out, and I get all these fish, and obviously they're bigger than the 3 inch by 3 inch holes, right? Does that mean in the world that in the ocean there are no 2 inch by 2 inch fishes? That would be a weird looking fish, I'm sorry, but you get the idea, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't smaller fishes, it just means the net can't capture it, right? Same thing with science. Just because science can't deal with the non-measurable, the non-predictable, doesn't mean it's not there, right? It's still there. Things like act, potency, they're still necessary to explain the world. Causes, God, all those things are still necessary. Science just can't address them because that's not what their method does. Okay? It doesn't mean science is bad. It doesn't mean philosophy is bad. It just means they're doing different things. You all with me there? One of the things that physics has done is getting weird. You guys have heard of weird physics? Like quantum mechanics and stuff like that, right? It's great at predicting like where an electron is going to be or something like that, but it's bad when people try to draw metaphysical conclusions from it. Just because I can't predict where that electron is going to pop up doesn't mean the electron doesn't have a cause. Do you see what I'm saying? But science can't address that because that's not measurable and predictable. Y'all with me there? So we have to be careful with that stuff. And as I said before, science is dependent on philosophy to provide it with intelligent principles, causality, change, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of identity, the law of the excluded middle, that those are valid things that apply to the real world. Without them, you can't do science. So it depends on philosophy for these things. So there's that. The best argument against the existence of God, the best objection. If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, all-loving, etc., he would not want his creatures to suffer evil. But we do suffer evil. Therefore, either God does not exist, or he lacks one of the characteristics described above. In which case, he's not God in the way that Christians mean. This is a powerful argument, actually. This is the strongest argument against the existence of God. And I think it's the one that we as Christians have to grapple with the most, because we do believe that God is all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all of those things. So how can evil exist in the world? A lot of atheists, have you seen Bill Maher?
Yeah.
Guy is an idiot. He likes to latch on to arguments like this. He likes to go, oh, God is, there's evil in the world, so there's no way that God can exist, and all of you Christians are uneducated morons. None of you have ever studied anything in your life. Thomas Aquinas addressed this a long time ago. And centuries before that, St. Augustine addressed this. It's not like we pretended like this problem didn't exist and, aha, you suddenly got us in the year 2015. No, we've seen the problem, we've addressed it, and we've known it's there for a long time. St. Thomas Aquinas formulated it like this. It seems that God does not exist because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be destroyed. If therefore God exists, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world. Therefore God does not exist. So, St. Thomas Aquinas is, by the way, have I said it before, that he's the most awesome person ever? He, in his Summa Theologiae, he doesn't just give arguments for why he believes what we believe, why we believe what we believe, but he always addresses the objections of critics. And he tries to formulate those objections in the strongest possible terms. That way he's not being a sophist, or he's just not, playing with us. He's being very serious. He's a very sober philosopher. So he answers this question as follows. This is a very strong formulation of this problem. He says, as Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow evil to exist in his work unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good out of evil. As Christians, we know what the most profound evil thing that was ever committed, and what most profound good that came from it. What was that? The murder of the Son of God, right? But the most profound good was brought out of it. The salvation of the whole world. So that's what St. Augustine is getting at. God wouldn't allow evil to happen in the world unless he could bring good out of this evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist, and out of it still be able to bring good. Okay, so obviously the atheists have lots of objections to this. Well, if God made everything, did he make evil? I remember one of my high school students raised this question to me one time. And I said, what do you mean did he make evil? And he's like, God made everything, so it's evil. I was like, can you provide me with some evil real quick? Can you get me a jar of evil? Or a can of evil, or a bowl of evil? If you could bring me that. Actually don't, because if you can't provide that, you are the Prince of Darkness, and I don't want to talk to you anymore. We have to understand that evil is not a thing, the way like a ball is a thing that needs to be made, a thing to be made, right? St. Thomas says natural evil is the result of defect in matter, something that should be there that's just not there, right? So for example, blindness is a natural evil. It's not a thing, it's just something that's missing, right? So it's not something that had to be created. It wasn't like somebody put some evil putty in someone's eyes and now they're blind. It's not a thing that needed to be created, so there's no need for a cause of creation of evil. And then even things like, when a hurricane, is a hurricane evil in itself? It's just a storm, right? The evil is sometimes, the suffering that people go through as a result. But that's not a thing that was created, it's an action that happened, right? So it's not a thing in itself. So the question then is, why is there evil then? Why is there evil? If God didn't create evil, why does he even allow there to be evil in the world? How many of you read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis? Okay, the rest of you need to go home and read that book tomorrow, okay? If you haven't read that book, that is the best treatment of the problem of evil that I've ever seen. I mean, he addresses it top to bottom, left to right, he covers the entire thing. So you need to, since this is the objection that everyone's going to bring to you, all of your fellow students are going to bring to you the existence of God, this is the book you need to read. He says, in some sense, in a material world, some degree of evil is unescapable. It logically follows from there being a material world, right? In the sense that matter is limited. Imagine a hill. Is the hill as beneficial to the person going up it as to the person going down it? It's not, right? And material things are going to push up against each other because they're physical bodies. They're going to get in each other's way, which is going to result in defect and suffering and things like that. So the fact that there is a material world naturally entails some degree of this natural evil, right? So the question then that follows is then, but why is there so much? Sure, I get that, going up a hill and going down a hill, that's going to be something that's just going to happen in the material world. People are going to bump into each other in a material world. Those are things that are just going to happen in a material thing. Fine, but why is there so much evil? And the best logical answer to that question is, do you have an objective measure to determine what is the proper amount of evil that can be allowed to exist if God is real? Yeah.
Would free will be a good answer to that?
Free will is a good answer as to why there's moral evil. Okay? It's not a good answer as to why there's natural evils like blindness and things like that. Okay? But it's a good answer to why there's moral evil. The point is, we can't come up with a measure to say, this is the amount of evil. If there's any more evil than this, 3 feet of evil, then God can't exist. You can't come up with an objective measure like that. So you can't say, well, why is there so much? How could we possibly measure that as limited human beings? So that's not a good objection. But I think the hardest part of this is when we say, how can God bring good? And I think this for me existentially has been the hardest question to answer. I think in my early 20s, there were points where I was like yelling at God over this, which is silly, but he can take it. Why do little children suffer? Why does a child in Africa get Ebola? Why does someone die in a fiery car accident? What possible good can come out of that? That just seems horrible. And if we're honest with ourselves as human beings, we all have to come to terms with, it does kind of seem awful. But I think there is a good logical answer to this question. I don't think there's a good emotional answer to this question. It's going to bug us no matter what, but there's a good logical answer. And that's what we're really looking for in philosophy anyway. It's a good logical answer. But we really don't have a God's eye view of the world. God can see every chain of causal actions intersecting with each other in the entire universe, from the smallest atom bouncing into each other to us being here in this room, to whatever. Somehow I ended up getting my degree in philosophy and somehow I ended up in this room. God sees every causal chain and how they interact with each other. He knows what the best way is to bring about the greatest good in the end. And that's the best. If our arguments for the existence of God are valid, which I think they are, and I highly encourage you to go out and study them more, I think they are valid, then we have to accept that the logical truth is the evil that does exist in the world, God allows for an ultimate greater good. So, that doesn't answer the emotional problem. Yes, sir?
So, this might be a little bit outside of the scope of this, but is it imprecise to say, or is it invalid to say that the devil is the formal cause of evil?
Yes, it would be imprecise to say that.
Would it be? Okay.
Yes, it would. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas say that evil actually doesn't have a form.
Right, okay.
It's a deficiency in the actualization of a form,
Right, okay.
in Thomistic terms.
Gotcha.
Okay, so, I think as Christians, maybe we can get some solace in this. We've solved the logical problem. I mean, it is possible in a universe with an infinitely good God for God to allow evil if we think of things in the way that we've been thinking of this. I think in the emotional side as Christians, we have some solace. I think it was St. Teresa of Avila who said that the greatest evil in the world that we experience now, when we get to heaven, that'll be just like one night in a bad hotel, basically. Or, we also think as Christians we have a redemptive view of our suffering. We join our suffering to the suffering of Christ. It has meaning in drawing ourselves and other souls to God. And so it is meaningful to us existentially and in our lives. But that's how we deal with the solace as Christians. And I think for me, if I wasn't a Christian, how impossible it would be for me to even deal with this problem on an everyday level. Logically, we've addressed it, we've solved the problem logically, but how do I live with that day by day if I didn't believe that God had a reason for it? It would be very hard for me as a Christian to address it. And I'll be honest with you, there have been times in my adult life where I have wandered far from my practice of the faith. And it was suffering in my life that turned me back in another direction. And I thank God for that suffering. So suffering was a good thing that he allowed in my life. I know somebody right now with 6 kids. And his wife, I'm not going to say, you guys won't know what it is. His wife is, this is so generic, but his wife has some mental illness issues. And she's trying to leave him. She's getting ready to leave him. And this is devastating for him. But I've never seen him practice his faith so passionately as I have seen him right now. So even in that, at least we can draw meaning from that to some degree. Ultimately, and I believe this to be true, ultimately, if God is infinitely good and he allows suffering in our lives, it has to be for the sake of our salvation or someone else's salvation ultimately. It has to be. So, all right. One little thing. What time is it?
8:35.
At 7:35. You guys finish
7:35,
at?
yeah, 7:35.
You guys finish at 8? Okay. I want to do one little thing, and then we'll take time for questions, because that will be much more interesting than listening to me talk anymore, okay? I don't know if you've heard this charge. He says, can't tell if it's Jesus, or Mithras, or Krishna, or Odysseus, or Romulus, or Dionysus, or Hercules, or Glycon, or Zoroaster, or Attis, or Horus, or Jesus. It's all the same story. Have you guys ever heard that Christians just rip the story off from the Mithraic cults, or the cults of Horus and things like that? So I've heard that before too. Actually, some guy posted something on Facebook about this. It's blatantly false. Like some guy back in like the 1800s literally made up the stories the same. He just decided to make it up one day, and everyone went back with it. So the response to that, LutheranSatire again, by the way, guys, you have to watch this stuff. I know, it's Lutheran, but we'll forgive them because they're doing good with these videos.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming out to our service this morning, and I pray that the rest of this Christmas day is wonderful for each and every one of you.
Not so fast, preacher man. Behold, it is I, Horus, Egyptian god of the sun, and while you all believe that you've been celebrating the birth of your Lord Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, thousands of years before your Jesus came around, I, Horus, was born on December 25th. I, Horus, was born of a virgin. I, Horus, was baptized by a man called Donnall the Baptizer, was crucified and was resurrected 3 days later. So you see, your Jesus is nothing more than plagiarized poppycock, and I, Horus, have come to feast upon the sorrow of you foolish Christians.
Yeah, none of the stuff you just said is true.
Yes, it is.
No, there's no reference in Egyptian mythology to Horus being crucified or resurrected 3 days later. There's no documentation anywhere for the existence of a figure named Donnall the Baptizer. Horus's mother was not a virgin woman, but the goddess Isis, and there is no specific date anywhere tied to the birth of Horus.
I'm pretty sure there is.
Actually, no. All of these claims and many others indicating that early Christians yoinked the mythology of Horus and stuck it on top of Jesus were all completely made up by Gerald Massey, a 19th century cuckoo banana bird self-taught Egyptologist who never provided the slightest shred of evidence for any of these claims and who was laughed out of the room by every serious Egyptologist on the planet. So thank you very much for your attempt to ruin our celebration of Christ's birth, but I'm afraid we're all still having a very Merry Christmas, Horace.
Horus? Did I say my name was Horus? No. What I meant to say was, behold, it is I, Mithras, Roman cultic god of the something. And while you all believe that you've been celebrating the birth of Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, I, Mithras, was born of a virgin. I, Mithras, had 12 disciples, and I, Mithras, gave those disciples a meal consisting of my body and my blood. Sound familiar, Christian dummies?
Actually, Mithras was born from a rock, not of a virgin. He had 2 companions, not 12 disciples, and the Mithraic meal was one he shared with the sun god, where they feasted not on his own flesh, but on the flesh of a bull. But even if those claims were true, Christians were already confessing the virgin birth, recognizing the 12 apostles, and celebrating the Lord's Supper before they ever encountered any Mithraic cults. So I'm afraid that you've taken neither the holly nor the jolly out of our Christmas, Mithras.
Oh, you must have misheard me. I'm not Mithras. I'm, Quetzalcoatl, Aztec god of the wind. And while you all think that you've...
No Christian on the face of the planet ever heard of Quetzalcoatl until the 16th century.
Well, then I'm Balder, Norse god of the...
There were 193 popes before Balder's mythology was actually written down.
Then I'm Horus, Egyptian god of the sun.
You already did that one.
Alright, fine. I didn't want to completely humiliate you, but you've left me no choice. I shall now unveil myself to be the ancient deity whose mythology was inarguably stolen by early Christians. Behold, I am...
The ancient Mesopotamian god of judgment, 6,000 years before your Jesus spoke of returning to condemn the lost and resurrect the faithful. My followers proclaim that I will return to destroy my enemies and raise the dead. So silence your joyful voices, Christians. Your Lord is nothing but a cheap carbon copy of me, the destructor who goes by many names. I am Volgus in Troha. I am Lord of the Cebulia. I am Gozer the Gozerian.
Gozer the Gozerian from Ghostbusters.
Dang it, why do so many people still know that movie? I don't understand. If all the things that Gerald Massey said about me were complete fabrications, there's no textual evidence whatsoever, why do atheists like Bill Maher reference these claims as if they were true?
Well, Horace, I suppose it is strange that people who insist that they won't believe anything without verifiable evidence are more than willing to believe anything without verifiable evidence, as long as that thing can be used to mock the gospel. But we shouldn't be surprised when people reject proof of Christ's resurrection in favor of demonstrable lies that let them remain in unbelief. After all, Jesus did say, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead.
I said that before Jesus did.
Oh, you absolutely did.
All right. So that's all I'm going to present on tonight. A couple of reading lists and books that you should read. How many of you know? How many of you read G. K. Chesterton? Yeah. Read Orthodoxy and The Everlasting Man. William Lane Craig is a Protestant, but he wrote a really great book called Reasonable Faith, where he does an excellent job establishing the historical reliability of the resurrection accounts. Edward Feser, he's like the best ever. So read everything by Edward Feser. If you don't read anything else after you leave tonight, read his book, The Last Superstition. Okay, remember that. What is the book? The Last Superstition. Read that book, okay? Because he just demolishes the new atheists, he embarrasses them, and they deserve to be embarrassed. I'm going to shamelessly plug one of my students from this last spring at Holy Apostles wrote a book called 20 Answers, Atheism from Catholic Answers. So buy his book. And then Peter Kraft, pretty much anything by Peter Kraft or C.S. Lewis. So, but definitely read The Last Superstition. Read it. Yes?
I'd like to add one. Made for More is also a good book.
By? Made for more.
Curtis Martin? Yeah. Curtis Martin?
Okay. And Edward Fazer was the reason why I ended up being able to understand philosophy and get a degree in it. So read him, he makes it very simple. So we have, as Peter Kraft always says, we have left the hell of lecture and are on to the heaven of questions. So if you have any questions, yes sir.
Where does the squirrel fit in?
Squirrel. Did I have a squirrel?
With the acorn and potentiality.
The squirrel is in potential to eat the acorn and can only be actualized by a cause. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question, maybe a comment too. Somehow you were connecting evolution with, or you made a comment about evolution. Were you connecting that with atheism or?
No.
And I'm not sure if I understood what your comment was, and you mentioned something about the last 3 popes or something like that.
Oh yeah. You know, there's a really St. Thomas Aquinas says to not present something as truth that's not truthable or demonstrably true, because it makes a mockery of the faith when we do that. And one of the dangers that I've seen is a sort of fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, which has been made very popular. We Catholics are not fundamentalists. We don't read the Bible in that way. But it reads the Bible in the way that the earth was created 5,000 years ago and in 6 days. That's demonstrably false. The earth was not created 5,000 years ago and in 6 days. Science has demonstrated that beyond a pretty reasonable doubt. I think personally that and you don't have to agree with me, but I think the theory of evolution has also been pretty well established by the fossil records, by the observations of how viruses change and form. So I'm pretty certain that I'm willing to say that I agree that evolution is scientific fact. I'll be right with you, okay? The last 3 popes have given a lot of credence to evolution as an explanation for how life arose. Now, as Catholics, the way we would understand evolution was we'd say that God is the first cause of all those changes as they're happening. Remember how we talked about that first cause that has to be underlying things? Not only do you need a first cause of existence, but you need a first cause of changes. So God will be the first cause that underlines all of those things. When we try to get into this, I don't know if you guys ever seen the Creationist Museum? It's hilarious, it's awesome and hilarious. It's got like cavemen, like these creationists, seriously, they create this museum, and in their exhibits there's like cavemen riding around on Triceratops and on Tyrannosaurus Rex and stuff like that. I mean, banana brain stuff. That being said, if you think there's good reasons to reject evolution, that's fine, but evolution is not a problem for us Catholics. It's not, we don't see it as an objection to our faith. We understand the narratives in Genesis as providing the truth that God created us, that the first 2 men and women turned away from him, which resulted in original sin and the need for a redeemer. But we don't literally, if you read the two narratives, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they actually contradict each other if you read them literally. When the ancient Hebrews put together Genesis, they knew that they contradict each other. Why? Because they knew that we weren't supposed to take every single detail as scientific and literal fact. But the spiritual truths behind it are true. God created everything. Man turned away from God and fell and was tempted by the devil. You know, Adam and Eve were our first parents and the promised Redeemer. That stuff is all what's meant. But we have to be careful. Father Robert Barron. How many of you guys know Father Robert Barron? Yeah, he's a great. He's now a bishop. Yeah, bishop. He said when people ask him, "Do you take the Bible literally?" That's a stupid question, because that's like asking, "Do you take the library literally?" Right? The Bible is not one book, it's many books, and certain parts are written in such a way that they're supposed to be taken as literal history. The Gospels, for example. And certain parts are poetry. Song of Songs. I'm sorry, but if you look at the way he describes the woman in Song of Songs, she wouldn't be very pretty in reality. That's not the point he's trying to make, it's a metaphor, right? Some parts of the Gospel or Bible are written to tell, to be poetry, and some parts are written like the first several chapters of Genesis, in a way to get across certain theological truths in the language that the Israelites understood, but are to be understood somewhat, what's a good word for it?
Well, yeah, symbolically, it's a mix, because you have allegory, you have symbolism, and you have fact. So, specify.
for me.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a lot of symbolism in a lot of sacramental symbolism in the first couple of books of Genesis.
You know, the thing, an interesting thing with Genesis is, first off, the people who wrote it, we know, had no scientific knowledge like we have. But if you read Genesis 1, everything goes in the proper order. So, the Bible is divinely inspired. That first account, the man who first wrote that out could not possibly know that everything happens in the evolutionary process in that exact fashion. So that's what he's saying, you know, that God is the cause. And not just the cause of the whole process, but he inspires that writer to make a scientifically correct chapter while also making a theologically correct teaching. You know, that God is the source of all things. And that he does it out of love. He looks on it and it is good, it is good, it is good. Everything is good. Matter is good, it is not wicked. And one of the things that comes up later in religion is this idea that matter is wicked and only the soul is good. Christianity and Judaism begin with matter being good. Another second thing is, for the first humans, no one has proven. There's always a missing link. I grew up going to the New York Museum of History, and they had the evolutionary symbols, you know, coming from, you know, the monkey going into the grass and walking and then very gradually becoming upright, and then Homo sapiens. But from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, there is a missing link which they have never found. And so there you bring in theology as well as science. Although I think now after Homo sapiens, the next thing is going to be, see, it was Homo, whatever it was, and then Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens, and now we're back to this. Because all of you walk like this. And so we have gone backwards in evolution.
I would
yeah,
say...
I wanted to just kind of continue just shortly, and I certainly appreciate, I'm learning a lot from mine.
Sure.
I'm Catholic, and I certainly need to know. I don't know if I have time to read all of the Summa. It's always nice to have short notes and that sort of thing. Some of the comments or the thoughts that I'm sharing with you are from the Colby Center, KOLBE Center.org, and so that's a place that it's a Catholic center also. They, on their booklet, Special Creation Revisited. Now, I don't know if you're...
I actually read the long version of that when I was younger, by Tan Publishers.
If your position is one of the four explanations of origins, as they mentioned in this, whether it's atheistic evolution, theistic evolution, progressive creation, or special creation, and where it is that
personally,
you
where I fall,
that your personal comments, based on my understanding is, as you're saying, the last three Holy Fathers' comments also, which probably came from the Pontifical Academy of Science,
sure,
which many people will say unfortunately has a political or a left leaning.
Lorenzo, get to the point. Cut it down, okay?
So that's just my comment. I know that there's more information, and I certainly have seen how the science does line up with the first 6 days of creation. There's a guy
okay.
that does
and as a Catholic, you're free to hold that position as a Catholic. I personally believe in theistic evolution.
Yeah.
As a Catholic, you're free to believe in special creation if you want, and that's fine. I think you had a question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, they actually let you. I was just going to say they were not bound by faith to believe in evolution.
Oh, true.
Also, we have 5 minutes.
Okay,
so move to those guys.
All right, gentlemen in the back. You first.
Yeah, when you're talking of suffering and like your logical explanation of that, can you expand on why that isn't like a fill in the gaps type explanation of that?
What do you mean by fill in the gaps?
So saying that like suffering, when you're talking about how the intertwining of suffering, like we can never know the cause and the causal relation to that.
Right.
Why is that not just
like kind of like we're just trying to justify something, basically? Well, I think it comes down to this. I think the proofs for the existence of God are valid. And I think the proofs for God's goodness are valid. So then, given those two premises that from that follows, if God is infinitely good and he is powerful, then it follows then he must have a reason for allowing the suffering. So it's that logical progression right there.
Okay.
I don't always know what the reason for each amount of suffering is. We can't answer that question. But if the proofs for the existence of God are valid, if the proofs for his goodness are valid, then it logically follows that the evil he allows in the world must be for a greater good in the end. All right, yes, sir.
So one question is, are you, how familiar are you with like pop quantum physics?
I mean, I have a book that I've read on quantum physics, and it reads it from a Thomistic perspective. There are a lot of problems with quantum physics. First of all, how are you going to interpret it? Is it the Copenhagen interpretation? Is it another interpretation? The law of causality is more fundamental than quantum physics, though, because it's a metaphysical law.
Right.
Something can't come from nothing. So any interpretations of quantum physics that fail to... They can say the variable's missing, the system is the cause, or causality is not determinate. And Thomists have never said that causality is a determinate thing. It just, you have to have a cause.
Right. Are you familiar with the work that's been done in like the last 10 years that basically posits that, really short, space and time aren't as fundamental as we thought, and that there's another layer basically just called information, because
Sure.
reality is emergent?
This is all act and potency is what these scientists are all basically doing. And they're going to keep finding another layer, but they're going to have to realize at some point you have to find a fundamental one.
Right. So the conclusion that they've gotten from this is basically that reality has certain aspects to it that are similar to phenomena that we find in computer science.
Sure.
So that it's basically called the hologram hypothesis, and there's his name's Jonathan Ratz. He's a Christian YouTuber online that connects this to like Platonic idealism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but like just like I know that was like da 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 da, but like what do you make of that? Just
I'll say this. Problem with quantum mechanics is that it is an extreme mathematical abstraction. We've abstracted so far away from our fundamental experience of reality, creating layers upon layers and layers of equations, that it's not certain that we're even actually describing reality through quantum mechanics anymore, so much as we are created this mathematical system that works for prediction right now, but might not work tomorrow if we come up with a new system. So we got to be very careful with quantum mechanics.
And a final comment is that Pius XII actually accepted evolution.
So Pius XII. Yeah, we got to go.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more? Or are we ready?
We
What
have
time
like
is it?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, that's it. We got to wrap. Okay.